The morning Josephine Bristol buried her husband was the same morning she decided she would never again lean on another living soul for as long as she drew breath on this earth. That was the summer of 1873, in the hard-baked territory of New Mexico, where the sun showed no mercy and the red dust settled into everything you owned and everything you were. Thomas Bristol had been thrown from his horse during a cattle drive 3 miles east of the Rio Hondo, and by the time the hands brought him back to the homestead on a makeshift litter of pine branches and canvas, he was already gone. Josephine had stood in the doorway of their small adobe house, her 3 boys pressed against her skirts: Eli, who was 7, Marcus, who was 5, and little Noah, who had only just turned 3, and she had looked at her husband's still face and felt the world rearrange itself permanently beneath her feet. She did not cry in front of the men. She thanked them quietly, sent them back to the cattle, and walked inside. She stood at the kitchen table for a long moment, her hands pressed flat against the rough wood, and then she rolled up her sleeves and began to cook supper. The boys ate. She did not. And when they were asleep, she sat in the darkness of the front room and allowed herself exactly 1 hour of grief, the kind that shook her whole body and left her throat raw and her eyes swollen. And then she folded it up like a letter she would never send and put it somewhere deep inside where it would not interfere with the work that needed doing. That had been 8 years ago. In the spring of 1881, Josephine Bristol was 34 years old and had the kind of quiet authority that came not from any title or ceremony, but from simply surviving things that would have undone lesser people. She ran the Bristol ranch with efficiency and a firm hand. Eli, now 15, worked cattle with the skill of a man grown and the stubbornness of someone who had watched his mother never once complain. Marcus, at 13, kept the books and mended fence and had a way with horses that bordered on the miraculous. And Noah, now 11, trailed after his brothers with his heart wide open and his eyes wider, hungry for everything the world had to offer. They were good boys, strong boys. Josephine had made sure of that. What she had not made sure of was herself. She spoke to her sons in instructions and affirmations. She spoke to the hands in clear directives. She spoke to the storekeeper in Cedar Creek, the nearest town 4 miles down the main road, in polite and efficient exchanges. She did not speak of longing. She did not speak of the cold side of the bed in winter. She did not speak of the particular ache that came over her sometimes in the evenings when the light turned golden and soft, and the boys were all occupied, and the ranch settled into the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like absence. Josephine Bristol had raised 3 sons on grit and silence, and she had convinced herself so thoroughly that she was content that she had very nearly stopped noticing she was not. The cowboy arrived on a Tuesday. It was the kind of April Tuesday where the sky could not decide what it wanted to be, shifting between pale blue and a thick white that threatened rain but never delivered. Josephine was mending a section of the south fence, alone, because Eli and Marcus were moving the herd to the upper pasture, and Noah was at school in Cedar Creek until the afternoon. She had her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and she was working the wire with a pair of pliers when she heard the sound of a horse coming up the main road at a steady trot. She did not look up immediately. Riders came through. It was not unusual. But this rider slowed, and then stopped, and when she finally straightened and turned, she found a man sitting on a tall bay horse at the edge of her property line, holding his hat in his hand. He had dark brown hair that was overdue for a cut, several days of stubble that had not quite decided to be a beard, and the kind of sun-worn face that could have belonged to a man of 30 or a man of 40, though something in the alertness of his dark eyes suggested he was somewhere in the middle. He was broad-shouldered and lean in the way of a man who spent his life outdoors, and he wore trail clothes that had been hard-used but were clean enough. "Morning, ma'am," he said. His voice was unhurried, like someone who had learned long ago that the world moved at its own pace regardless of how quickly you spoke. "I'm not looking to impose. I saw the fence and thought maybe you could use an extra pair of hands." Josephine looked at him without expression. "I have hands," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that." He nodded at her pliers. "I only meant that there's about 40 yards of loose wire on your south fence and the corner post is beginning to lean. Probably the work of two people, if done right." She studied him for a moment. She had learned to read men quickly. 8 years of running a ranch alone had made her a careful judge of what a man's eyes did when he thought he was not being watched. This man's eyes were straightforward. They held no calculation she could detect, no particular hunger, no false brightness. "Who are you?" she asked. "Clayton Hadley," he said. "I've been riding through from Tucson. I'm looking for work in this territory, preferably steady ranch work, but I'm not too proud to take a day's labor where I find it." "Clayton Hadley," she repeated. "You have references." "I do. I worked 4 years for the cowhound spread outside Tucson, and before that 2 years with the Reyes family in the San Pedro Valley. I can give you names and locations." She looked at him for another long moment, then looked at the fence, then looked back at him. "The corner post has been leaning since February," she said, which was not quite an admission that he was right and not quite a dismissal. "You can put your horse in the near paddock. There are tools in the barn." His name was Clayton Hadley, and he was 36 years old, though Josephine did not learn that for some time. He worked on the south fence for the better part of that Tuesday, and he did not talk much, which she appreciated. He reset the corner post with a competence that was quiet and thorough, tamping the earth down firm and checking the angle twice before he was satisfied. He restrung the sagging wire with careful, practiced movements. When Eli and Marcus came back down from the upper pasture in the afternoon and found a stranger working their south fence, they pulled up their horses and stared. "Mama know about him?" Eli asked to his brother rather than to the stranger. "I expect I do," Josephine said, coming around the side of the barn with a bucket. "Eli, Marcus, this is Clayton Hadley. He's doing day labor today." The boys looked him over with the particular wariness of young men who had grown up the men of a household and were not entirely sure what to do with another man on the property. Clayton met their eyes without deference or challenge, just a level acknowledgement that seemed to satisfy some unspoken requirement, and Eli finally gave a short nod. At the end of the day, Josephine paid Clayton Hadley a fair wage from the tin box she kept in the kitchen, and she said, "The Harmon Ranch, 12 miles north, is usually looking for hands in spring." It was not an invitation to stay. She was very sure of that. She was simply being informative because she was a practical woman and the man needed work. "Obliged for the information," he said. He took his hat from the fence post where he'd set it, settled it on his head, and walked to the paddock to retrieve his horse. Josephine went back inside and started supper. He did not go to the Harmon Ranch. Or rather, he went there first, but the Harmon Ranch had already filled its seasonal crew 3 days prior, and when Clayton Hadley came back through Cedar Creek 2 days later and went into the general store for supplies, Josephine Bristol happened to be there buying flour and lamp oil, and the storekeeper, a round, cheerful man named Daniel Pratt who made it his personal mission to know everyone's business, said, "Shame about Harmon's crew being full up. You do good work, Mr. Hadley. I heard about Mrs. Bristol's south fence from Eli when he came in yesterday." Josephine felt rather than saw Clayton Hadley's gaze find her across the store. "I was actually going to ask at the mill," Clayton said, not looking away from her, "or at the freight office." "You could ask me," Josephine said before she had fully decided to. She set her flour on the counter and turned to face him properly. "I have a ranch hand who's leaving at the end of the month to go back to his family in Texas. I have not yet found a replacement." It was a practical offer. She needed a hand. He needed steady work. The logic was unimpeachable. "I'd be grateful," he said. "You understand I run a tight operation," she said. "I expect hard work, honest dealing, and respect for my family. The bunkhouse has room for 2. The other hand, Mr. Perkins, will be there until the end of the month." "Understood," said Clayton. "Good," said Josephine, and turned back to Daniel Pratt to finish her order, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. She told herself the whole way home that it meant nothing, and the familiar logic of it settled her mind adequately. What the logic did not settle was the small, unreasonable awareness of him that seemed to have installed itself without her permission. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing she would have dignified with a name. It was more like the way you noticed a change in the weather, a slight shift in atmospheric pressure, a quality of the air that was different without being identifiable. She dismissed it with the practiced efficiency she applied to every impractical thing in her life. Clayton Hadley moved into the bunkhouse on the 1st of May, and if old Perkins had any opinions about the new hand, he kept them largely to himself, except once to remark that the man worked hard and did not waste words, which from Perkins was high praise. The boys formed their own individual assessments. Eli watched Clayton with the cool, measuring eye of someone who had appointed himself his family's guardian, and for the first 2 weeks he found reasons to be nearby whenever Clayton was doing any task in sight of the house. Clayton seemed to understand this without it being said, and he never tried to win Eli over with false friendliness or extra attention. He simply worked well and consistently, and when Eli one afternoon got his rope tangled badly around a fence post while working a young colt, Clayton walked over and untangled it without comment and went back to what he was doing. That evening, Eli mentioned at dinner that the new hand knew what he was doing with horses. He said it to his plate, not to his mother, but he said it, and Josephine noted it and said nothing. Marcus was less guarded. He was the child who had his father's natural curiosity and his mother's observational sharpness, and he had been watching Clayton for a week when he finally followed the man out to the barn one morning and said, "My mama says you worked in Tucson." "That's right," said Clayton, checking the hooves of one of the work horses. "Is it hotter there than here?" "Considerably." "What made you leave?" Clayton looked at the boy with an expression that was neither annoyed nor falsely charmed. "I'd been there long enough," he said simply. "A man needs to move sometimes or he starts to calcify." Marcus turned this over. "Calcify," he repeated. Like bone," said Clayton. "Stops being flexible, hard and brittle instead of strong." Marcus seemed to find this a satisfying answer and walked back to the house, and after that he had a habit of asking Clayton small questions when the opportunity arose, the kind of methodical investigation that was entirely in his character. Clayton answered directly and without condescension, and that was enough for Marcus. Noah was a different matter entirely. Noah had no defenses whatsoever. By the end of the first week, he had decided that Clayton Hadley was the most interesting person to arrive in his life in recent memory, and he followed the man around with the wholehearted devotion of a puppy that has chosen its person. Clayton handled this with a patience that Josephine found herself watching more than she should have. He never turned the boy away. He answered every question. He let Noah walk beside him to the feed store and carry the smaller items. He showed him, one afternoon, how to tie a proper bowline knot, and then let him practice it 14 times until he got it right, never once showing impatience. Josephine watched this through the kitchen window while she was peeling potatoes, and she felt something move in her chest that she did not examine too closely. May turned warm and then turned hot, as it always did in this part of New Mexico territory, and the work of the ranch expanded accordingly. The spring calf crop needed branding, and the summer pasture rotation needed planning, and the water trough on the east side needed new planking because the bottom had rotted through. Josephine worked alongside her hands without distinction, which sometimes startled men who had not worked for a woman before, but Clayton took it in stride as though it were simply sensible, which it was. One morning in the 3rd week of May, they were working together in the near pasture, Josephine keeping the rope taut while Clayton worked a stubborn fence staple, when without warning the skies that had been building all morning opened up in a sudden hard rain. It was the kind of rain that came down in sheets, the kind that soaked you to the bone in 30 seconds, and there was no shelter nearer than the barn, and the barn was a 1/4 mile away. Josephine kept working. She was already wet and the staples still needed driving. Clayton glanced at her and laughed, not mockingly, just a short, genuine sound of surprise at her determination, and kept working too. They finished in the rain. By the time they walked back to the barn, both of them were completely soaked, and Josephine's hair had come loose from its pins and was plastered dark across her cheek, and she was aware of this and had no particular way to address it in the moment. In the barn, she wrung out the end of her braid and said, without turning to look at him, "The fence on the east side will need checking after this. Rain like this can undermine posts." "I'll check it this afternoon," he said. He was pulling his wet shirt away from his skin, not immodestly, just practically, and he looked at her sideways. "You should get dry clothes," he said. "I've been soaked through before and it doesn't hurt me, but you." "I have been soaked through more times than you likely have," she said pleasantly, and walked out of the barn toward the house. But she was smiling. She noticed that only after the fact, when she was inside and pulling dry clothes from the dresser, and she stopped with her hand on the drawer and acknowledged the smile to herself and then put it away somewhere, just as she had learned to put everything away. She was good at putting things away. The trouble was that Clayton Hadley was very hard to put away entirely, because he was not doing anything that warranted the effort it took to manage. He was simply present in a way that was consistent and real. He did the work. He ate supper in the bunkhouse without imposing on the family. He was respectful of Josephine's authority over the ranch without making it into a point or a performance. He did not flatter her or seek her approval or make any move that she could have pointed to and called inappropriate. He was simply a good man doing good work. And the problem, the actual, specific problem that Josephine finally had to name to herself one sleepless night in June, was that she had forgotten what it felt like to be near a good man. And now that she was reminded, her body and her heart had apparently decided that 8 years of silence was quite enough. She lay in the dark of her room and thought about Thomas. Not with grief anymore. The grief had smoothed itself over time into something quieter, more like the memory of a feeling than the feeling itself. She thought about him with fairness and with fondness, and she thought about what he would have said if she had told him about the way she felt when Clayton Hadley laughed unexpectedly. She thought Thomas would have said, "Good," because Thomas had been a generous man and had loved her in the direct, uncomplicated way of someone who wanted above all else for the person they loved to be happy. But thinking what Thomas might have approved of was not the same as knowing what to do about it. She turned over. She looked at the ceiling. She told herself she was being foolish, that she was reading meaning into the ordinary decency of a man doing his job, that she was lonely and 8 years was a long time, and the first kind man to appear was benefiting from accumulated absence rather than his own particular qualities. She told herself that very convincingly and went to sleep. In the morning she went to the kitchen to find Clayton already there. Not inside, he would never have presumed, but standing on the back porch with a cup of coffee he had made himself from the fire pit outside, talking to Noah, who had apparently woken early and gone out to investigate before anyone else was up. Clayton had a thin line of concern between his brows that he smoothed out when he heard the door, but not before Josephine saw it. "What is it?" she asked. "One of the calves got through the east fence," he said. "I found the gap when I went to check it after last night's rain. She's about a mile out, maybe more. I was going to track her." "I'll go with you," Josephine said. "You don't need to. The east section runs along the Caldwell property line," she said. "There's been some tension with the Caldwells about that line this spring. I want to be there." He accepted this without argument. They rode out together in the early morning, when the light was still amber and low, and the desert smelled of wet sage from the previous night's rain. They rode in a companionable silence, which Josephine had noticed was something Clayton seemed to understand, that silence could be comfortable rather than a void that needed filling. Thomas had talked constantly, pleasantly, a running commentary on everything around him, and she had loved that about him. But this was different, and she did not feel the need to compare the two things. They found the calf about a mile and a half out, stuck in a dry arroyo with a sore leg, frightened but not seriously hurt. Clayton went down into the arroyo on foot and got her calmed and checked her leg thoroughly before they worked together to get her back up onto level ground. And the whole operation took 40 minutes, and during it, they talked only as needed short, practical exchanges about the angle of approach and the best way to support the calf's leg during the climb. When they had her moving and headed back toward the ranch, the light had climbed higher and the morning was fully open around them, and Josephine said, "You have a good way with animals." He looked at her briefly as though checking whether there was more behind the statement. "I've had a lot of practice," he said. "So have I," she said. "But some people practice their whole lives and never get past the mechanics of it. You have an actual feel for it." There was a short silence. "That might be the kindest thing you've said to me since I arrived," he said, and there was a careful note in it, nothing pressing, nothing expectant, just an honest observation. Josephine felt the warmth of it but kept her face still. "I'm not unkind," she said. "No," he agreed. "You're not, you're careful." The word landed with a quiet precision that she found slightly uncomfortable because it was exactly right, and being known accurately by someone you were trying not to think about was its own particular difficulty. "I have 3 sons and a ranch to run," she said. It came out more clipped than she intended. "I know," he said, and left it there. The Caldwell business came to a head in late June. It had been building since March, when Harlan Caldwell had started making noise about the shared boundary line on the eastern edge of the Bristol property, claiming that the original survey had placed the line 20 yards further west than the current fence ran. Josephine had the original land grant documents and they were clear, but Harlan Caldwell was the kind of man who believed that clarity of documentation mattered less than persistence of claim, and he had twice sent his sons over to move fence markers, which Josephine's hands had moved back. On a Thursday afternoon in late June, Harlan Caldwell rode to the Bristol ranch with 2 of his sons, and Josephine went out to meet them at the property line with the land grant document in her hand. She was alone except for Marcus, who had come out of the barn to see what was happening, and Clayton, who had been working on the water trough nearby and had straightened up and walked over with a quiet unhurriedness that was somehow more authoritative than urgency would have been. Harlan Caldwell was a big man with a red face and the kind of loud voice that substituted for argument. He made his claim again, more aggressively this time, and used some language that he probably would have moderated if he had been more aware of his audience. Josephine let him finish. Then she opened the land grant document and held it out. "This is the original survey, filed in 1866 and registered with the Territorial Land Office," she said. "The eastern boundary is marked by the cedar grove, which has not moved. Your fence markers have moved twice by your own son's hands. I know this because I watched them do it the second time." Harlan's face went redder. "A widow woman showing papers at me," he said, with the particular contempt that some men reserved for women who had the audacity to know what they owned. Clayton took 1 step forward. It was only 1 step, but it had a weight to it that changed the geometry of the conversation. He said nothing. He simply made himself present in a way that was clear and utterly without aggression, and met Harlan Caldwell's eyes with the steady patience of a man who was not going to move. Harlan looked at Clayton. Then he looked at Josephine. Then he looked at the document, which he could not actually read from where he sat on his horse, but whose existence was undeniable. "We'll see what the land office says," he said, pulling his horse around. "They will say the same thing the document says," Josephine said pleasantly, "because it is the same document they have on file." The Caldwells rode away and Marcus let out a breath beside her. "He's not going to stop," Marcus said. "No," Josephine agreed. "But he's not going to win either." She went to Cedar Creek the next morning and filed a formal record of the boundary dispute with the county clerk, which was exactly the right thing to do, and which she had known all along was the right thing to do. The Caldwells made one more attempt in July to dispute the line, and the county clerk's office responded with a letter that referenced the original survey and the formal complaint record, and that was the end of it. Harlan Caldwell did not speak to Josephine again for the rest of the summer, which suited her perfectly. What she did not forget was that Clayton had stepped forward without being asked and without overreaching. He had not tried to take over. He had simply made clear that she did not stand alone, and then let her handle it herself. She thought about that more than she meant to. The boys had moved from wariness to acceptance to something closer to genuine attachment, each at his own pace and in his own way. Eli's transition was the most significant because it had been the most guarded. It came about through a chain of small events over the course of June and July, but the one that mattered most happened on a Saturday afternoon when Eli was trying to break one of the young horses, a skittish gray that had been giving him trouble for 2 weeks. Eli was good with horses, but the gray had a particular pattern of resistance that Eli kept meeting head-on, and every time he met it head-on, the horse got more resistant. Josephine was watching from the fence and could see the cycle building, the horse getting more agitated and Eli getting more frustrated in a way he would never have admitted, but that the horse could feel clearly. Clayton came and leaned on the fence beside her. They watched together for a few minutes. "He's fighting the same fight," Clayton said quietly, to Josephine rather than to Eli. "Yes," she said. "Should I say something?" she considered. Eli's pride was a real thing and needed to be handled honestly. "Let me ask him," she said, and called out to her son. "Eli, Mr. Hadley's watching. You want his observation." The fact that she had asked rather than simply invited the intrusion mattered. Eli pulled the gray up, breathed, and said with studied casualness, "Sure." Clayton climbed the fence and came to stand near Eli, not crowding him, and spoke in a low voice so it was just between them. Josephine could not hear what was said, but she saw Eli's jaw loosen slightly, saw him nod once, saw him adjust his approach with the horse. The gray, after 2 more tries, settled into a canter that had give in it instead of resistance, and Eli rode him out with a look on his face that was equal parts relief and dawning satisfaction. He didn't thank Clayton loudly. But on the way into supper he fell into step beside him and said, "That bit about the lead change made sense. I've been trying to force the transition." "It's a common mistake," Clayton said. "Even experienced riders do it." "Did you do it?" "More than I'd like to admit." Eli went quiet for a moment. "I'd like to hear about some of the horses you've worked with sometime," he said. If there's time for it." "There's always time for a horse story," Clayton said. That was the turn. After that, Eli's guardedness did not disappear. He was built too much like his mother for that, but it became something else, a respect that had room in it for more. Josephine noticed all of it. She filed it carefully in the place where she was building an honest accounting of Clayton Hadley, adding to it every day the way you add water to a well, steadily, without ceremony. In August, she had a bad week. It started when a late summer storm took a section of the barn roof, which needed emergency repair and cost more than she had budgeted for, and was compounded when one of the work horses developed a lameness that turned out to be a deep stone bruise that would keep him off work for 2 to 3 weeks, and was completed when she received a letter from her late husband's brother in Missouri who was asking, not for the first time, whether she had considered selling the Bristol homestead and bringing the boys east. She sat at the kitchen table with that letter for a long time after supper. The boys were in bed. The house was quiet. The lamp burned low on the table and the letter was in her hand, and she felt, for the first time in a while, the specific weight of all of it, the 8 years, the work, the decisions she had made alone in rooms like this one, the letters she had written herself late at night when the boys could not see her face. She was still sitting there when she heard a quiet knock at the back door. She straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand quickly and said, "Come in." Clayton opened the door and stepped just inside the threshold, hat in hand. He had seen the light still burning and had knocked before he thought too much about whether he should. He took one look at her face and said simply, "Are you all right?" The question was so direct and so honest that it caught her off guard in a way that flattery or circumspection never would have. She held the letter for a moment and then said, "I have a brother-in-law who writes periodically to suggest that I cannot manage." "But you can manage," he said. "Yes," she said, "I can. I have done nothing but manage for 8 years." There was a silence in which she became aware that she had said more than she usually did, and she set the letter down and looked at the table. "Managing," Clayton said slowly, "is not the same as being all right." The words were quiet and careful, but they arrived like something laid gently against a bruise, not pressing, just acknowledging. She felt her throat tighten and her jaw set against it automatically, the way it always did. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I saw the light and I shouldn't have knocked. I'm sorry." "No," she said before he could back out of the door. She surprised herself. "No, sit down for a moment." He looked at her for a moment, then pulled out a chair and sat down across the table from her, hat still in his hands, and waited. She looked at the letter. She looked at the lamp. She did not look at him while she gathered words that she had not used in 8 years, words that had to be coaxed out like something that had been kept in the dark too long and needed time to remember that light was safe. "When Thomas died," she said, "I made a decision. I decided that I was sufficient, that everything I needed I had in myself or in those boys, and that asking for anything was a form of weakness I could not afford." She paused. "It was not a foolish decision for the circumstances." "No," he said carefully, "it was probably the right one." "It was," she said, "and I do not regret it." She was quiet for a moment. "But I have been doing it so long that I have—" She stopped. "Try it again." "I have forgotten how to say when something is hard. I know that it is. I feel it, but the words do not come easily." Clayton turned his hat slowly in his hands. He did not fill the silence with anything, just let her find her way through it. "My brother-in-law is not a bad man," she said. "He is simply a man who cannot imagine that a woman alone might know her own mind and her own land better than he does. Every letter is the same." She smoothed the paper on the table. "And tonight I was tired enough that I almost," she caught herself, "almost believed him," Clayton said quietly. She looked at him then directly for the first time during the conversation. "Almost felt the weight of it," she said. "Not believed him, I will never believe him, but felt the weight." "That's different," he agreed. "Yes." Another silence, but different now, warmer. The lamp made the kitchen into something smaller and more contained. "For what it's worth," Clayton said, "I have worked for a number of operations in this territory and outside it. And what you have built here, the way this place runs, the condition of the animals, the quality of the hands, the way your boys work is the product of someone who knows exactly what she is doing. Every day." Josephine looked at him. There was nothing performative in his face. He was simply stating what he had observed. "You do not have to," she started. "I'm not doing it to make you feel better," he said. "I'm saying it because it's true and because someone ought to say it to you." The silence that followed had a different weight altogether, and Josephine felt something in her chest unlock with a small, almost audible interior sound, like the mechanism of a clock that has been wound too tight finally finding its rhythm. "Thank you," she said, quietly but fully. He nodded. He stood, settled his hat on his head. "Good night, Mrs. Bristol." "Good night, Mr. Hadley," she said. After he was gone, she sat at the table for a long time, not crying, not anxious, just letting herself be aware of something that she had been carefully not naming for months, and now was forced to look at directly, because it had come and sat across from her at her own kitchen table, and looked back at her with honest, unhurried eyes. She wrote back to Thomas's brother the next morning, a letter that was firm and clear and permanently closed the question, and she felt better having done it. She did not, however, resolve the Clayton Hadley problem, and the Clayton Hadley problem grew more pronounced through August and into September with the sustained indifference that problems have when you choose not to address them. He was always simply there, mending something, working something, moving quietly through the periphery of her days with the steadiness of someone who intended to be nowhere else. In the evenings she would sometimes see him sitting outside the bunkhouse in the last light, reading. He had a small collection of books that he'd carried from Tucson, well-worn and much repaired, and she found herself curious about the titles, though she had never asked. She was setting up the fall roundup in the second week of September when she made the small, practical decision to invite him to eat supper at the main house. It was a practical decision because they needed to discuss the logistics of the roundup, and it was more sensible to do it over food than to stand in the yard. She told herself this firmly and went to the bunkhouse door in the late afternoon and knocked. He opened it with a slight look of inquiry. "Supper," she said. "We need to talk through the roundup schedule, and it may as well be at the table." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. It was not the first time he had eaten inside. He had eaten in the kitchen during a few working lunches in summer. But this was supper in the evening, which was different in a way that Josephine acknowledged was different, and then firmly categorized as purely practical. The boys were in their customary spots and did not react to Clayton's presence with any notable ceremony, which was itself a kind of ceremony, the ease of it, the naturalness. Noah made room at the bench without being asked. Marcus asked Clayton directly about the horse rotation for the roundup before Josephine had even started serving. Eli passed the bread. It was ordinary and it was terrifying, though Josephine kept the terror entirely internal and served the meal with her usual composure. The roundup discussion was genuine and productive, and Clayton had good instincts about logistics, particularly the water situation on the north pasture, which needed addressing before the herds moved. After supper, when the boys were doing their evening work and the dishes were done, they sat at the table with a hand-drawn map of the property that Josephine had made herself in 1874 and worked through the schedule systematically. It was the longest uninterrupted conversation they had had, and it moved naturally from the roundup logistics into a discussion of the cattle market, and then into the question of the water rights that connected the Bristol Ranch to the upper watershed, and then, somehow, into a conversation about the nature of this territory and where it was going. "The railroad is coming through within the decade," Clayton said. "That changes everything for the cattle operations." "I know," said Josephine. "It changes the economics, potentially significantly. Some of the smaller ranches won't survive it," he said. "The Bristol Ranch will survive it," she said, and there was nothing uncertain in her voice. He smiled at that. It was a genuine smile, warm and a little surprised, the kind that happened before the decision to smile rather than after. "I believe that completely," he said. She looked at him across the map, and for a moment the lamp between them was the only light in the room and the house was quiet around them, and she felt the full force of the thing she had been not naming since April, clear and unmanageable and entirely her own. She looked back down at the map. "The North Pasture water issue," she said. "I think we need to dig out the secondary channel." "Yes," he said, and they moved on, and neither of them mentioned whatever had been in the moment before, but Josephine was aware that he had felt it too. She could not have pointed to the specific evidence, but she had gotten very good at reading the atmosphere, and the atmosphere in the kitchen had changed in a way that could not be entirely accounted for by lamp oil and open windows. She lay awake that night and had the long, honest conversation with herself that she had been avoiding. She asked herself if she was being reckless and answered that she was not. She asked herself if she was being foolish and answered that she was being human, which was different. She asked herself if Thomas would recognize what she was feeling and answered that he absolutely would, because Thomas had been very good at reading her and what she was feeling was not subtle. She asked herself, finally, if she was afraid, and that answer took longer and came more quietly. Yes, she was afraid. Not of Clayton Hadley, not of his character or his intentions, both of which she had observed steadily for 5 months and found trustworthy. She was afraid of the particular vulnerability of letting herself be seen, completely and without management, by another person. She had not done that since Thomas, and Thomas was 8 years gone, and in the interval she had become someone whose identity was built substantially around the structure of her own self-sufficiency. To want something from someone else was to become dependent on the possibility of receiving it, and Josephine Bristol had been absolutely dependent on no one for 8 years. She thought about what Clayton had said in August. Managing is not the same as being all right. She thought about the way he had sat across from her in the quiet kitchen and not tried to fix anything, just listened. She was 34 years old. She had raised 3 sons on grit and silence. She had kept a ranch whole through drought and dispute, and every difficulty this hard country had presented. She was not a woman who needed rescue, but she was, it turned out, a woman who was tired of silence. The first frost came early that year, in the first week of October, which was unusual but not unheard of. It came overnight and left the morning grass silver, and the water trough sheeted with a thin ice that Noah broke with a rock with great satisfaction before anyone else was up. Josephine stood on the back porch with her coffee and looked at the altered world, the silver grass, the sky bone pale and high, the mountains to the north with their first dusting of snow on the peaks, and felt, for no particular reason she could identify, as though something was about to happen. Clayton came from the bunkhouse across the frost-bright yard and stopped when he saw her on the porch, and she said, "I need to tell you something." He came and stood at the foot of the steps. He was in his working clothes, hat not yet on, and the cold morning air had put color in his face, and he looked up at her with the quiet attention she had come to recognize as specifically his. She had planned, in the 4 hours between deciding to say something and this moment, to say it efficiently and with some degree of composure. What actually happened was that she stood on her back porch with her coffee cup in her hands and said, "I have been trying very hard not to think about you as anything other than a hired hand, and I have been unsuccessful, and I thought you ought to know that." It was not the speech she had planned. It was considerably more direct than the speech she had planned. But once it was out, she felt less like she was carrying something that did not belong in her body, which she supposed was the point. Clayton was very still for a moment. Then he said, "I am glad you told me." "I am not asking you for anything," she said quickly, because she needed that to be clear. I don't need anything to be done about it. I have been keeping that, and I found I could not keep it much longer without saying it out loud." "Josephine," he said, and the use of her given name for the first time had the effect of making the rest of her prepared speech dissolve entirely. He came up the 2 steps and stood on the porch, close enough that she could see the particular steadiness in his eyes that she had been cataloging without meaning to for 5 months. "I have been trying to manage the same thing from my side since May," he said. "I have not said anything because I was not sure of my welcome, and because it seemed important not to complicate your life in a direction you had not chosen." "I appreciate that," she said, somewhat faintly. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "I'm not a man given to impulse. What I feel is, it is not a small thing and it is not a passing thing. I would not say anything about it if I thought it was either of those." She looked at him directly. Her voice was steady. "I would not have said anything if I thought it was either of those," she said. They stood on the back porch in the first frost of October, and Josephine Bristol finally let herself be fully present with the feeling she had been managing and filing and tucking away since the April morning she had turned from the south fence to find a man on a bay horse holding his hat and asking to be useful. "I don't quite know how to do this," she said honestly. "I have not done this in a very long time." "Neither have I," he said. "I think we do it the same way we do everything else." "Which is?" "One day at a time," he said, "and honestly." She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, a real smile, the kind that she very rarely let herself have, unguarded and full, and it changed her face in a way that he watched with an expression she recognized now as the mirror image of what she had been carefully not showing for 5 months. "All right," she said. "One day at a time." Noah erupted through the back door at that moment, vibrating with the energy of someone who had broken ice in the water trough, and considered this the most exciting event of the season. And the moment dissolved into the practical morning of a working ranch with 3 boys and a first frost and all the work that entailed, but it dissolved without leaving any of the anxiety it had carried before. It dissolved into something that felt, surprisingly, like ease. The months that followed were not a sudden transformation. Josephine was not built for sudden transformations, and Clayton understood that. What happened was a gradual, deliberate deepening, the kind that happens when two people who are both careful and honest simply allow themselves to be honest with each other across all the ordinary days that make up a life. They talked. That was the central thing that changed. Not just the practical exchange of ranch information and roundup logistics, but actual conversation, the kind where you say what you think and then listen to what the other person thinks, and find that the world is slightly larger afterward. They found they disagreed on some things. Clayton thought the North Pasture could support more cattle than Josephine was running, and she thought he was underestimating the drought risk and told him so directly. And they had a genuine argument about it that lasted 2 days and ended with neither of them fully capitulating, but both of them incorporating the other's point into a modified plan that was better than either original position. Josephine found this argument, in retrospect, one of the most satisfying conversations she had had in years. She told him about Thomas. Not all at once, and not in a way that was grief-burdened, but in the natural way that a person tells another person about the life they have lived. She told him about meeting Thomas at a social in 1865 when she was 18 and he was 20, how he had talked so much she'd been exhausted and charmed in equal measure, how they had married 8 months later and moved to New Mexico Territory the following spring with 2 horses, a wagon, and a map that proved to be considerably optimistic about the terrain. Clayton listened to all of it. He asked good questions. He did not seem threatened by Thomas's memory, which she had been mildly worried about, and which revealed more about her own concern for his comfort than she had quite intended it to. He told her about his own life, which had been less settled, the son of a Kentucky farmer who had come west at 22 looking for what he thought of at the time as possibility, and had found it, but also found that possibility, when you chased it long enough, tended to leave you with a great deal of experience and fewer anchors than a man might want as he got older. He had never married. He had been close once, and had not gone through with it for reasons he described without bitterness as mutual incompatibility that they had recognized just barely in time. He had spent 14 years moving between operations, learning everything there was to learn about cattle and horses and land in this territory, and he was good at it. But somewhere in the last few years the moving had started to feel less like freedom and more like avoidance. "What were you avoiding?" she asked. "The thing I'd been telling myself I didn't need," he said. She let that sit for a moment. "Which is?" He looked at her with an expression that was completely unguarded. "This," he said, "exactly this." The boys navigated the change with the remarkable adaptability of children who have lived their whole lives in a world that required adaptation. Eli, who had the most investment in the question, was also the most deliberate. He came to Josephine one Sunday evening in November when his brothers were occupied and said, with the careful directness of someone who has rehearsed something but is still nervous, "Are you happy, Mama?" She looked at her eldest son and saw all the years in his face, the 7-year-old pressing against her skirts at his father's funeral, the young man who had taken on the weight of the ranch as though it were his birthright and not a burden he had chosen. She said, "Yes, Eli, I am." He nodded. "Good," he said, and then after a pause, "He's a good man." "Yes," she said, "he is." Eli went back to whatever he had been doing, and Josephine sat still for a moment with the warmth of it. Marcus needed less reassurance but wanted more information, which was entirely consistent with his character. He asked Clayton directly, one afternoon when they were working together in the barn, what his intentions were with respect to his mother. He phrased it with the formal gravity of a 13-year-old who had decided he was going to be an adult about this, and Clayton met the gravity seriously and said that his intentions were completely honorable and that he hoped, when the time was right, to ask Josephine a question that would require her son's blessing as much as her own, and that he valued that blessing genuinely and not as a formality. Marcus considered this for a long moment and then said, She doesn't like to be surprised." "I know," said Clayton. "I've noticed. If you're going to ask her something important, you should make sure she's in a position to think about it properly, not after a long work day. Not when she's tired." "That's good advice," said Clayton. "I know," said Marcus, with the unself-conscious confidence that was uniquely his, and went back to the horses. Noah required the least managing of all. Noah had decided approximately 3 weeks after Clayton's arrival that he approved, and nothing in the subsequent months had changed his mind. By November, he was referring to Clayton in conversation with friends from school, in a way that made his specific status unclear but his importance obvious. And when one of his schoolmates asked who Clayton was, he said, with total ease, "He's ours." Josephine heard this secondhand from the schoolteacher, who related it with a warmth that suggested she found it charming, and Josephine spent an entire evening quietly undone by the simplicity and rightness of it. December came cold and sharp, and the ranch settled into its winter rhythms, the slower pace of the off-season, the long evenings that were genuinely long now rather than empty. The bunkhouse wood stove was adequate but not luxurious, and Josephine began, as a practical matter, to invite Clayton to spend evenings in the main house more regularly. It was colder in the bunkhouse. The kitchen fireplace was better. These were facts. They sat in the evenings after the boys were in bed, sometimes talking and sometimes not, and the silence between them now was the comfortable kind, the kind that meant you trusted a person enough to exist in the same room without performing. Clayton had a habit of whittling small figures, nothing elaborate, just something to do with his hands, and Josephine sewed, and the fire crackled, and outside the New Mexico winter was deep and cold and absolute. On a Friday evening in the second week of December, the boys were all in bed and the fire was burning well, and the silence had been comfortable for a long time when Clayton set down his whittling and said, "Josephine." She looked up from her sewing. "There is something I want to ask you," he said, "and Marcus told me not to ask you after a long work day and not when you're tired, and it has taken me 2 weeks to find a Friday evening where you aren't obviously exhausted, so I am going to ask it now while the conditions are right." She felt her needle stop moving. "Did Marcus tell you to preface it that way?" "No," he said. "That part is just me." He was looking at her with the same complete openness she had first seen in his face on the back porch in October, the expression that had nothing behind it and nothing beside it, just him, entirely present. "I want to stay," he said, "not as a hand. I want to stay as I want to be here, with you and the boys, for the long run if you'll have me." The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved against the house. Josephine set down her sewing and looked at the man across the fire from her, this man who had arrived in April on a tall bay horse, and had spent 8 months becoming as familiar as the south fence and the sound of the water trough and the particular blue of the New Mexico sky in the evening, and felt the full weight of the decision, and was not afraid of it. She was not afraid because she had looked at it from every angle and found it solid. She was not afraid because she knew this man the way you know a person when you have watched them in ordinary days for 8 months, the way that is more revealing than any number of grand gestures. She was not afraid because she was 34 years old and had been managing things alone for 8 years, and had finally, in the last 2 months, remembered what it felt like to not be alone, and the memory had restored something in her she had thought was permanently gone. "Yes," she said. Clayton was quiet for a moment, as though the word had to settle before he could be sure it was real. "All right," he said, then more softly, "all right." They were married in February of 1882, in Cedar Creek, in the small church on the main street that had been built in 1875, and had weathered every dust storm and drought since. It was a small ceremony. Josephine had not wanted theater, and Clayton had followed her lead, but the church was full because Cedar Creek was not so large that a wedding went unnoticed, and because Josephine Bristol had lived in this community for 8 years and had the respect of most of it, and because people were genuinely glad. The boys stood up with them. Eli, serious and proud and blinking harder than usual. Marcus with his straight spine and his precise attention. Noah, who had been forbidden by his brothers from crying and who lasted until the moment the minister said family, and then gave up entirely on the prohibition, and cried with wholehearted cheerfulness, while Eli passed him a handkerchief. Josephine wore the best dress she owned, a deep blue wool that she had made herself in November, and she carried a small bunch of dried winter flowers tied with ribbon, because there were no fresh ones in February in New Mexico. Clayton stood beside her in a dark coat that fit him well and had been pressed for the occasion, and when she came down the aisle, he looked at her the way a man looks at something he cannot quite believe has become his real life. Daniel Pratt cried in the back pew, which surprised no one. After the ceremony, there was a supper in the church hall, organized by the women of Cedar Creek with the comprehensive generosity of a community that takes social events seriously, and it went on until late, and the boys ate 3 pieces of cake each, and Noah fell asleep on a bench in the corner in the last hour and had to be carried to the wagon, which Clayton did without being asked and without making a production of it, just picked the boy up and settled him gently and pulled his coat over him. Josephine watched this from across the room and felt, in that moment, the specific fullness of something that had been empty for a very long time and was now entirely and genuinely full. They drove home in the cold February night, the boys bundled in the wagon bed, the sky enormous and star-crowded overhead, and Josephine sat on the wagon seat beside Clayton with his shoulder warm against hers, and the horses knew the road home and took it steadily, and no one needed to say anything. Spring came, as it always did, in a rush after the long winter, the desert greening unexpectedly, the sage blooming silver-purple, the cattle moving back toward the upper pastures with the particular purposeful energy of animals that know the seasons. The ranch moved into its planting and branding rhythms, and the new arrangement settled into the household the way good things settle naturally, without requiring adjustment or announcement. Clayton was not Thomas, and he was not trying to be Thomas, and the boys understood this in their various ways. He was himself, present and steady and consistent, and what he brought to the household was not a replacement of what had been but an addition to it, a new thing that had its own specific shape. Eli, at 16 now and growing into himself with the determination of someone who has been shaping his identity consciously for years, began working with Clayton on the horse operation side of the ranch in earnest, and what had been an apprenticeship of necessity became a genuine partnership of interest. Eli wanted to expand the horse breeding side of the Bristol operation, which was a good idea that Josephine had been considering for several years, but had not had the capacity to pursue. Clayton had experience with horse breeding from the Tucson years, and the two of them, Eli with his passion and Clayton with his experience, made a persuasive case to Josephine over the kitchen table one March evening, with charts and figures that Marcus had helped compile. She approved the expansion with conditions and a budget, and the first new breeding stock arrived in April, which happened to be 1 year to the month from Clayton's first arrival, a symmetry that she noted privately and found pleasing. Marcus, meanwhile, had developed a serious interest in the law. He was 14 in the spring of 1882, and already reading every legal document Josephine had ever filed with the county: the land grant, the boundary dispute records, the water rights agreements, with the focused intensity of someone discovering a vocation. He had an exchange of letters with the county clerk, who was amused and then genuinely impressed by the specificity of the young man's questions, and who told Josephine when she came in one day for a routine filing that her son had a real legal mind. Josephine was not surprised by this, but she was proud, and she and Clayton talked about what schooling options might be available, which led to discussions about the future in ways she had not allowed herself to think very seriously before. She had been so focused for so long on the immediate and the necessary that the long view had felt like a luxury. Now it felt accessible. Noah turned 12 in June, and celebrated with a party that Noah organized himself, inviting every friend he had from school and two he had made from neighboring ranches. And the Bristol yard was full of children for an entire Saturday afternoon in a way that filled the house with noise and chaos, and a specific bright happiness that lingered in the rooms afterward. Clayton made Noah a wooden horse for his birthday, a careful, detailed carving that he had been working on for 3 weeks, and which Noah received with the kind of speechless delight that is more expressive than any words. In July, Josephine told Clayton she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before the boys were up, in the kitchen where the early light came through the east window and made everything golden. She had known for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks examining her feelings about it from every angle, as was her way, and had found that when she got past the surprise, because it was a surprise, though a logical one, what she found was a warm, quiet joy that settled deep and stayed there. He went still in the way he went still when something important happened, and then looked at her with an expression that she recognized as the specific look of a man receiving something he had not let himself hope for too directly. How are you feeling about it?" he asked, which was exactly the right question. "Good," she said. "I feel good about it." She paused. "It has been a long time since I was with child. I was 31 with Noah and he is now 12. I am 35. "You are in excellent health," he said. "Josephine, you are the hardest working person I have ever met." "That is not entirely medically relevant," she said, but she was smiling. He came and held her face in his hands, very gently, and looked at her with so much feeling that she had to look back at him straight and accept all of it without deflecting, which was something she was still learning to do. "Thank you," he said, low and completely sincere. "Thank you," she said back. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth, and outside the window the July morning was building its heat, and the horses in the paddock were beginning to move, and somewhere in the house one of the boys was stirring. She told the boys that same evening. She told them plainly, as she told them everything, without prologue or apology. Noah's face went from confusion to delight to a very loud expression of enthusiasm that filled the room. Marcus asked 3 practical questions in rapid succession about logistics and health and timeline, which Josephine answered directly and which she found, as she found most of Marcus's responses to major information, oddly comforting in their practicality. Eli said nothing for a moment. He sat at the table with his hands around his coffee cup. He had started drinking coffee in the last year and still looked slightly self-conscious about it, and then he looked up and said, "You're happy, Mama." "Very," she said. He nodded once. Then he looked at Clayton across the table and gave him the nod that meant approval, the one that had started as grudging acknowledgement and had become, over the course of a year, the genuine article. The pregnancy was not difficult. Josephine was strong and healthy and had done this 3 times before, and while she accepted help where it was offered, she did not become incapacitated by the condition, which she considered unacceptable. She worked the ranch with modifications throughout the summer and into the fall, and Clayton managed the practical adjustments without making her feel managed, which was a considerable achievement. Fall brought the roundup and the branding and the preparation for winter, and the additional hands they had taken on for the season made the operation run more smoothly than any year in Josephine's recent memory. The horse breeding program Eli had proposed was showing early results that were better than projected, and Marcus had finished compiling the first formal accounts ledger of the Bristol operation, a thorough and elegant piece of record-keeping that Josephine read cover to cover and pronounced excellent, and then asked him to update quarterly. In October, Clayton rode into Cedar Creek and came back with a letter from the county clerk that concerned him enough that he set it on the kitchen table when Josephine was sitting down and said, "I need you to look at this." It was about the water rights on the upper watershed. There was a new railroad survey that had been done in August, and the survey ran the proposed line in a way that would potentially affect the water easement agreements that the Bristol Ranch shared with 2 neighboring operations. It was not an immediate crisis, but it was the kind of thing that could become one if not addressed proactively. Josephine read the letter twice. Then she said, "I need to talk to Harmon and to the Ray's family." "I thought the same," said Clayton. "And Marcus needs to read this," she said. "He will want to." Marcus did want to, and he spent 3 evenings with the letter and the original easement agreements, and produced a remarkably cogent analysis of the legal implications that the county clerk, when Josephine brought it to him, read with an expression of genuine admiration, and said he wished some of the practicing lawyers he worked with were as clear in their thinking. The water rights issue took 2 months to resolve, involving 2 meetings with the neighboring ranch families, 1 formal letter to the Railroad Survey Office, and 1 trip to the county seat that Josephine made with Clayton and Marcus in tow, the latter of whom acquitted himself in the county clerk's office with a composure and precision that made Josephine privately certain of what her middle son was going to be when he grew up. The railroad modified its survey line by the end of November, routing it 50 yards south of the original proposal, which removed the conflict with the easement agreements. The county clerk recorded the modification and Josephine filed the documentation, and that chapter closed. The winter of 1882 settled in, and the Bristol house was fuller than it had been in 8 years. Clayton had taken over the far bedroom that had been a storage room since Thomas's time, and had cleared it and made it functional, and what had been a room full of things that needed doing was now a room full of the small signs of a person who lived there: worn boots by the door, books stacked on the single shelf, a coat hung on the hook. Josephine found herself happy in a way that was not loud and not dramatic, but was constant, the way good weather is constant, just there, every day, reliable and genuinely felt. The baby came in March of 1883. It was a long labor and an honest one, and Josephine approached it with the same determination she brought to everything. And at the end of it, there was a boy red-faced and loudly opinionated about his arrival, whom they named Samuel Thomas Hadley, the Thomas for the man who had made the Bristol Ranch possible, and the Samuel because it was a name they both liked, and it suited him. The older boys met their new brother with reactions that were entirely in character. Noah held him with a careful tenderness that belied his usual boundless energy, speaking to the infant in a soft, private voice, as though they were having a confidential conversation. Marcus examined him with the thorough attentiveness of someone taking inventory, and declared him healthy. Eli held him last, and was the most surprised by his own feelings. Sat in the chair by the fire with the baby in his arms, and looked at him for a long time with an expression that was quieter than anything, and afterward said, to no one in particular, "He looks like he knows something." "All babies look like that," Clayton said. "Maybe they do know something," Noah said, which was sufficiently Noah that everyone smiled. Josephine, in the bed, watching her husband hold their son in the firelight with her 3 older boys around them, felt the full completed shape of her life as it now was. It was not the life she had planned at 18, or at 26 when Thomas died, or at 34 when she had told herself she was sufficient and needed nothing. It was something she had not been able to plan, because you cannot plan for what you are not yet capable of imagining. It was full, and it was real, and it was hers. Samuel was a determined child from the start, opinionated and bright-eyed and entirely aware of his own importance, which the household did nothing to discourage. He developed early a particular bond with Eli, who was the one who could always calm him when he was fretful, which delighted everyone and slightly surprised Eli himself, who had not considered himself the infant-calming type. By midsummer of 1883, the ranch was in its best shape it had ever been. The horse breeding program had its first sales, 3 well-bred young horses that went to operations as far as Albuquerque, and the profit from them was enough to fund a new section of fencing on the north boundary that Josephine had wanted for 2 years. The cattle numbers were solid, and the fall market was looking well. Marcus had begun corresponding with a school in Santa Fe that offered secondary education to students from the territory, and Josephine and Clayton had agreed together that if Marcus wanted to go, they would support it fully, which was the kind of decision that could only be made by two people working together toward the same future. Eli, at 17, had grown into himself more fully than Josephine had words for. He was taller than Thomas had been, and had the same quality of stillness that she recognized in herself. But he had also, over the past year, found a humor that he had not previously allowed himself, a dry and unexpected wit that appeared at odd moments and could make everyone at the table laugh when they weren't expecting it. Clayton brought some of that out in him. She thought the particular ease that comes from being around someone you've stopped having to perform for. Noah, at 13, was a force of nature who brought joy to every room he entered and was loved by everyone in Cedar Creek without apparent effort. He had an aptitude for music that had surfaced the previous winter when Daniel Pratt's wife had given him a few lessons on the parlor organ, and he had proven a natural. He played at church services now and was attempting, with more enthusiasm than precision, to learn the fiddle. Samuel, at 5 months, was beginning to recognize faces and had decided that his mother was, unambiguously, the most fascinating person in his world, a judgment she returned completely. One August evening after supper, when the boys had all dispersed into their evening activities, and the baby was sleeping, and the heat had finally come down to something bearable, Josephine and Clayton sat on the front porch and watched the sun go down over the red hills. The sky was doing what the New Mexico sky always did at the end of a hot August day, turning colors that had no names, deep orange bleeding into purple, the first stars appearing while there was still enough light to see the land clearly. Clayton had his arm along the back of the bench, and she was leaning into his side in the way she had allowed herself to learn, the comfortable familiarity of people who have lived beside each other and have stopped being surprised by the ease of it. "Do you know what I was thinking about this morning?" she said. "Tell me," he said. "That morning in April last year when you came to the south fence," she said. "I was thinking about what would have happened if I'd sent you away. If I'd said I had enough hands and told you to move on." "What made you not say that?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "The corner post was genuinely leaning," she said. He laughed. It was the full laugh, the one she had first heard in the rain over the south fence, genuine and warm, and she felt it in her chest the same way she had then. "Practical to the end," he said. "Always," she said. But she turned her head and looked at him and let him see the thing behind the practicality, the thing she had learned to stop filing away and start simply having. "I am glad I didn't send you away," she said. "So am I," he said quietly. The stars came out, one by one, the way they always did over New Mexico, first the bright pioneers and then the whole enormous crowd of them. The Milky Way broad and luminous across the center of the sky, the kind of sky that reminded you that the universe was very large and you were very small, and that this was not frightening but extraordinary. Inside the house, Samuel made a small sound in his sleep and then settled back into quiet. From the direction of the bunkhouse, where the older boys had gone to play cards, Noah was teaching Eli and Marcus a game he'd learned at school and making up rules as he went, which they all knew but played along with. There came the sound of laughter. Josephine listened to all of it, the baby's quiet breathing carrying through the open window, her boys laughing in the evening, the sound of Clayton's steady heartbeat under her ear, the vast dark night around the house, holding all of it, the ranch and the land and the particular piece of this world that she had built and kept and defended and loved with everything she had for 8 years of silence and grit before this man had arrived in April and held his hat in his hands and asked if she needed help. She had said yes, eventually, in her way, at her pace, on her terms, with her whole heart. She had said yes, and the word had turned out to be the most practical thing she had ever done. In the years that followed, Cedar Creek grew slowly, as the railroad did eventually come through, changing the economic landscape of the territory in ways that Josephine had long predicted. The Bristol ranch adapted and continued, as Josephine had said it would. The horse breeding operation became the ranch's primary revenue, a thing Eli had believed and worked toward since he was 16, and by the time he was 20, he had earned a reputation across the territory for quality stock that stood entirely on its own merit. Marcus did go to Santa Fe for his schooling, and then further east for the legal training he had been moving toward since he was 13 years old, and the letters he sent home were thorough and excellent, and made his mother and his stepfather as proud as they had ever been. He came home in the summers and contributed to the ranch accounts with a precision that grew more sophisticated every year. Noah stayed the most constant in Cedar Creek, eventually taking on the music teaching that Mrs. Pratt had begun, instructing the children of the town in piano and organ, and playing at every social and church service with a generous pleasure that was entirely his own. Samuel grew up on the ranch that was his from birth, and grew into a boy who had his mother's self-possession and his father's patience, and his older brother's influence in equal measure, which made him a formidable small person. By the time he was 3, he was following Eli around the horse paddocks with the same devotion Noah had once followed Clayton, and the wheel of it made Josephine smile every time she saw it. She and Clayton had 2 more years of trying before Josephine became pregnant again, in 1885, and this time it was a girl, born in the spring of 1886, whom they named Clara after Clayton's mother who had passed many years before. Clara was born into a household that had room for her, and then some, received by 4 brothers ranging in age from 3 to 18, with a warmth that varied in expression, but was uniform in feeling. Eli held her with the same surprised tenderness he had brought to Samuel, and Noah declared immediately that she was perfect. And Marcus came home from Santa Fe to meet her, and spent most of a week methodically noting all the ways she was already demonstrating good judgment, which was not something anyone else would have observed in a newborn, but which Marcus found evident. The Bristol Ranch, and it remained the Bristol Ranch, by Josephine's wish and Clayton's complete agreement, because it was what it was, and the name carried the history of everything that had made it what it was ran on through the 1880s and into the 1890s, through the changes that the territory brought and the ones the wider world sent. The boys grew into men who went out into that world carrying the particular character that had been shaped in the adobe house, and the Cedar Creek pastures, and the long evenings around the kitchen table. Josephine Bristol, Josephine Hadley now, though she answered to both without preference, remained exactly who she had always been, which was to say capable and self-possessed and clear-eyed, and now unsilenced. She had found, in the years since that October morning on the porch when she had said out loud what she had been keeping, that speech was not the weakness she had trained herself to believe it was. That saying a true thing out loud to the right person did not diminish it but enlarged it. That being known, completely and without management, by someone who chose to stay was not vulnerability but its opposite. She ran the ranch. She raised her children. She loved her husband with the same quiet steadiness that she brought to everything, and he loved her back with the particular love of a man who knows exactly what he has, having spent enough years without it to understand its value precisely. On a spring morning in 1887, which was the clearest and sweetest kind of New Mexico morning, Josephine stood at the south fence that she had been mending when Clayton first arrived, 14 years having passed since they had stood at this same fence in the rain and laughed about the absurdity of working through it. The fence was sound now, had been sound for years. She was checking it out of habit, the way you check things that have been fixed to make sure they hold. She heard the horse behind her and turned, and Clayton came riding up on a different bay. The original horse had retired to peaceful pasture years ago, and this one was one of Eli's breeding, excellent stock, and pulled up at the property line and looked at her from the saddle with an expression that was achingly familiar. "Corner post holding?" he asked. "Perfectly," she said. He smiled. She smiled back. In the distance, from the direction of the house, they could hear Clara's voice raised in some sharp disagreement with her brother Samuel, the particular pitch of a 1-year-old who has opinions and intends to be heard, and Samuel's higher voice responding in what appeared to be negotiation. "I should get back," Josephine said, still smiling. "Yes," he agreed. He reached a hand down. She took it, and he pulled her up behind him on the horse, and they rode back toward the house together under the enormous spring sky, toward the sound of their children, toward the smoke already rising from the kitchen chimney where someone had started the breakfast fire, toward the ranch that bore the name of everything she had built and everything that had been built upon it. She was not silent anymore, had not been for a long time. She had spoken her heart out loud on a cold October morning to a cowboy who had been listening all along from the very first day. And the life that had followed was the full and rounded answer to every year of silence that had come before. It was enough, and then some. It was everything.